Okay, so this would be much easier to do if I were here today, but I'm not. So here it goes. There were three major Allied powers in World War II after Hitler turned his back on Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. So these two were allies, and then they were enemies. So that meant that Stalin became an ally with England, who was led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and the United States, who was led by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Hitler, over here in Germany, had invaded France, and Italy was an ally of his, and he had invaded Poland and was spreading out and about to approach on to England. And then when he ran into some trouble there, he started turning his sights towards Stalin and the Soviet Union. He'd also invaded North Africa. So Stalin was in a bind because Hitler was well on his way towards invading and conquering Russia. Stalin desperately needed the Allies, meaning England and the United States, to open up a second front against Hitler, so he would have to divide his forces and fight a two-front war, both here and here. Stalin wanted that so it would take the pressure off him here on what was known as the Western Front. Churchill didn't want to open up a second front here because that would bring Hitler's army within 26 miles of England and invading England, which he'd already successfully fought off before. FDR really didn't have a dog in this fight, except he was more of an ally to Winston Churchill than he was Stalin. So he was going to side with Churchill in whatever Churchill decided to do. Churchill and FDR decided to invade in Africa, northern Africa. That did open up a second front, but not the one that Stalin was looking for over here in France. So it didn't take near the pressure off of him that this front over here would have been. So the Allies were successful in beating back the Germans here, eventually working their way up to Rome. And on the day that Rome fell, to the Allies, they also opened up the second front that Stalin desired over here in France with the D-Day invasions. And then it was just a matter of time. Hitler had to fend off both sides in this. So today's in-class activity, you're going to be assuming all three identities. If you have a group of three, one of you is going to play the part of FDR, one of you Winston Churchill, and one of you Stalin. If you have a group of two, then you pick which two leaders you want to be. And if you're working by yourself, you can pick whichever one you want. But you are going to be writing a letter to your other two allies. So if you're Roosevelt, you're going to be writing a letter to Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. That would start out, "Dear Churchill and Stalin." If you're going to be Winston Churchill, you're going to write your letter to Roosevelt and Stalin. And so your letter would start out, "Dear President Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin." And if you're Stalin, you'll start off your letter with, "Dear Franklin Roosevelt," or "Dear Roosevelt and Winston Churchill." And then you're going to explain your point of view. So if you're Stalin, you want to explain that they need to open up a second front here to take the pressure off him so he doesn't collapse. Because if he collapses, then it leaves Hitler wide open and gives him much more power than he would have before. Churchill is going to explain that he doesn't want the second front here because that will bring the German army closer to him where he doesn't want. And then Roosevelt will explain that he is going to side with Winston Churchill. And then and explain why they're going to open up this second front down here in Africa as opposed to in France. So your letter will need to address respectfully your allies, explain your personal perspective from the letter writer's point of view, and then also show an understanding for your allied partner's point of view. So if you're Roosevelt, you're going to show an understanding for Churchill and Stalin's point of view. If you're Churchill, you're going to show an understanding for Roosevelt and Stalin. And likewise, if you're Stalin, you're going to show an understanding of Churchill and Roosevelt. All right, so the slides should fill in the gaps from what I didn't explain here. Have fun. It is World War II.